In the world of billionaire dining, food is an experience, not a necessity. But behind the doors of elite society lie some of the worst tragedies ever recorded. From a man whose final mistake was eating a rare imported delicacy to another who spent hours tasting a prized specialty food in pursuit of a massive prize. Hey everyone, it's Nathan, and welcome back to Fatal Files. It was October 17, 2015, and guests were arriving at a secluded California estate overlooking the Pacific Ocean for an exclusive private dinner hosted by a billionaire. The property buzzed with anticipation as staff prepared to serve a rare delicacy few people had ever tasted before. Curtis Etheridge was 41 years old and had built a fortune through a series of successful business ventures, eventually becoming a billionaire. Despite his wealth, he remained heavily involved in organizing the private events hosted at his estate and took a personal interest in every detail. Meticulous and highly organized by nature, he preferred staying involved in the planning process rather than leaving everything to staff. I've always found it interesting how some people stay heavily involved in the details even after becoming enormously successful. Most would hand everything off to staff, but not Curtis. The dinner had taken months to arrange. The featured ingredient had been sourced from overseas and transported through multiple distribution points before arriving in California. Its rarity was part of the attraction, and many guests had attended specifically for the chance to try it. While guests enjoyed cocktails and conversation overlooking the ocean, Curtis spent most of the evening moving throughout the estate, checking on preparations, speaking with staff, and handling last-minute issues. By the time the final course arrived, shortly after 9 p.m., most of his responsibilities for the evening were finally behind him. For the first time all night, Curtis sat down and joined several guests in tasting the featured dish. The atmosphere remained relaxed as conversations continued and waves crashed against the cliffs below. After hours of overseeing the event and making sure everything ran smoothly, I imagine that moment felt like a well-earned break. Nearly 40 minutes later, Curtis shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Sweat began forming across his forehead, and his face became noticeably flushed despite the cool evening air. Curtis quietly excused himself from the table and started walking toward a hallway connecting the dining pavilion to the main residence. He had only covered about 20 feet when his pace noticeably slowed. One hand pressed against his abdomen as he paused beside a wall, appearing to steady himself before continuing. A short time later, his condition took a sudden turn for the worse. He stumbled forward and nearly lost his footing before staff members rushed toward him. Severe nausea quickly overwhelmed him, forcing him to one knee as concerned guests moved away from the table and staff cleared space around him. What had been a relaxed and celebratory atmosphere only minutes earlier suddenly turned tense and confused as concern began replacing the excitement of the evening. Over the next several minutes, Curtis became visibly weaker. The color drained from his face. His breathing grew increasingly rapid, and he struggled to answer simple questions from those attempting to help him. Emergency assistance was called immediately, but the estate's remote location several miles from town created an unavoidable delay. Hidden behind private roads and difficult to access after dark, the property wasn't somewhere responders could reach quickly. While everyone waited for help to arrive, Curtis's condition continued to worsen. Staff members stayed beside him and tried to keep him conscious, but he became increasingly unresponsive. By the time responders reached the estate nearly half an hour later, he was in critical condition. Curtis was transported for treatment, but despite continued medical efforts, he died later that night. Investigators later determined that the featured dish contained imported fermented fish that had been exposed to temperature fluctuations during transport. Laboratory testing identified elevated levels of botulinum toxin, a dangerous neurotoxin that can develop in improperly stored food. While several guests sampled small portions, Curtis consumed a larger serving after spending much of the evening overseeing the event. Testing also revealed uneven toxin distribution, with the portions served to Curtis containing some of the highest levels detected. The final report concluded that Curtis died from acute botulinum toxin poisoning after consuming the contaminated seafood. Investigators determined that improper handling during transportation played a significant role in the tragedy, and the death was ruled accidental. A meal doesn't have to look suspicious to become the worst thing a person eats. Near the foothills of Oregon, a woman's search for the purest ingredients available would eventually bring something dangerous into her kitchen. It was May 12, 2016, and a renovated farmhouse outside Portland, Oregon, was buzzing with activity as a woman prepared what she called the perfect meal. Built around ingredients she had spent months researching and sourcing, the dinner represented nearly a year of planning and refinement. Jocelyn Underwood was 38 years old and had become a billionaire after selling a highly successful media company. With few business obligations remaining, she spent much of her time traveling, exploring culinary traditions, and seeking out rare ingredients from around the world. Food had become less of a hobby and more of a personal passion, one she pursued with remarkable dedication. There's something admirable about that level of dedication, even if it can be a little difficult for the rest of us to understand. The dinner was meant to celebrate the completion of a personal project she had spent nearly a year developing. Every ingredient on the menu had been chosen for a reason. The vegetables came from small local farms, the herbs had been grown on the property, and even the cooking methods had been refined through repeated testing. One ingredient, however, received more attention than all the others combined. Several weeks earlier, Jocelyn had acquired a wheel of cave-aged artisan cheese from a small independent producer. The cheese was expensive, difficult to obtain, and considered by many enthusiasts to be among the finest examples of its kind. She stored it carefully and checked on it frequently, since it would be the centerpiece of the entire meal. Throughout the afternoon, Jocelyn moved between the kitchen and dining room, making final preparations. Then, by early evening, guests began arriving, and the meal unfolded exactly as she had hoped. Near the end of dinner, Jocelyn finally served the ingredient she had spent months anticipating. She sampled it herself before offering portions to several guests. A few minutes later, one guest remarked that the cheese tasted slightly different than expected, though nobody considered it serious at the time. Curious, Jocelyn tried it again. Something about it seemed slightly off, but not enough to cause concern. At the time, the unusual flavor seemed like a minor detail in an otherwise successful evening. The evening gradually wound down. Guests lingered around the dining table while Jocelyn began clearing dishes and organizing leftovers in the kitchen. Roughly an hour later, she suddenly felt lightheaded and stopped what she was doing. Thinking she might simply be exhausted after a long day, she leaned against a counter and waited for the sensation to pass. Instead, it intensified. Nausea followed, along with a sharp pain in her abdomen that forced her to sit down. Repeated bouts of vomiting left her increasingly weak, and she struggled to remain focused during conversations. Friends immediately called for help, while others stayed beside her. As the minutes passed, she became increasingly confused and had difficulty answering simple questions. Her breathing grew more labored, and the pain she described appeared to be worsening. By the time responders arrived, Jocelyn was barely conscious. She was transported for treatment, but her condition continued declining throughout the night. Despite intensive medical intervention, she died the following day. There's something especially sad about how much of herself she poured into that dinner, only for the evening to end the way it did. Attention eventually turned to the cave-aged cheese served near the end of the meal. Testing revealed contamination by Clostridium botulinum during the aging process, allowing botulinum toxin to develop despite the cheese appearing normal. Investigators also found that Jocelyn had sampled the cheese repeatedly throughout the day, consuming far more than any of her guests. Combined with uneven toxin distribution within the wheel, that likely explains why her symptoms became far more severe than those experienced by others. The final report concluded that Jocelyn died from acute botulinum toxin poisoning after consuming the contaminated cheese. The death was ruled accidental, and production records later helped identify failures during the aging process. Sometimes the most carefully planned meals create risks that nobody sees coming. In the mountains of Colorado, a billionaire's private retreat was about to become the setting for a food emergency that unfolded far faster than anyone expected. It was August 20th, 2017, and a billionaire's private retreat high in the Colorado Rockies was hosting a small dinner gathering after a day of outdoor activities. Surrounded by rugged mountain terrain and located more than an hour from the nearest town, the property offered guests both privacy and isolation. Zodny Berenger was 46 years old and had built a fortune through investments and business acquisitions over several decades. Known for his active lifestyle, he spent much of his free time traveling, skiing, and exploring the outdoors. The retreat was one of several private properties he used to host family members, close friends, and business associates throughout the year. The dinner itself was intended to be informal. Rather than a large banquet, guests gathered around a long wooden table overlooking the mountains as chefs prepared several courses using locally sourced ingredients. Much of the evening centered around fresh game, seasonal vegetables, and specialty foods sourced specifically for the retreat. As part of the evening's menu, guests were served pufferfish, a delicacy prized in some parts of the world, but infamous for requiring meticulous preparation before it can be eaten safely. Honestly, I probably would have tried it too. I mean, how often do you get a chance to eat something like that? As the evening continued, guests moved comfortably between dinner and conversation. Plates were cleared, drinks were refilled, and the atmosphere remained relaxed. Shortly after 8:30 p.m., the featured dish was served. I imagine the anticipation made that first bite even better. Zodny was among the first people to try the dish. For several minutes, nothing seemed unusual. Then, he noticed a tingling sensation around his lips and tongue. He took a sip of water and continued eating, expecting the sensation to pass. Instead, the tingling gradually spread through his mouth and jaw. When he tried speaking a few minutes later, his words sounded slightly slurred. The numbness continued worsening, making it increasingly difficult to speak clearly. Within minutes, Zodny noticed weakness developing in his hands. He struggled to maintain his grip on a drinking glass and eventually set it down after nearly dropping it. The weakness soon spread into his arms, and tasks that had felt effortless moments earlier suddenly required concentration. As the symptoms continued progressing, his breathing became noticeably more difficult. Each breath felt shallower than the last, and he began focusing entirely on drawing air into his lungs. What had started as a mild, tingling sensation was now rapidly affecting his ability to speak, move, and breathe normally. Emergency assistance was called immediately, but the retreat's remote mountain location created a significant challenge. I suppose that's the trade-off with places like that. The isolation is part of the appeal, right up until you need help in a hurry. Cellular reception in the area was limited, forcing several people to move around the property searching for a stable signal, while others remained with Zodny. As they waited, his condition continued deteriorating. He became increasingly weak and less responsive, eventually losing consciousness. By the time responders reached the retreat, a substantial amount of time had already passed. Zodny was transported for emergency treatment, but despite continued medical efforts, he died later that evening. Investigators later focused on the pufferfish served during dinner. Testing confirmed the presence of tetrodotoxin, a powerful neurotoxin naturally found in certain parts of the fish. The investigation revealed that a critical step used to remove toxin-bearing tissues had been performed incorrectly during preparation, allowing dangerous levels of tetrodotoxin to remain in portions of the final dish. The final report concluded that Zodny died from acute tetrodotoxin poisoning after consuming the improperly prepared pufferfish. Investigators determined that the preparation error had gone unnoticed before service, and the death was ruled accidental. Not every food tragedy begins with a meal being eaten. Along the coast of New England, a chef preparing the centerpiece of a Billionaire's signature banquet was about to encounter danger long before a single guest arrived. So far, we've seen contaminated seafood, deadly toxins, and a luxury meal that ended in tragedy. If you're enjoying the episode, don't forget to subscribe before we continue. It was February 8, 2018, and preparations were underway at a waterfront estate along the coast of Maine, ahead of a lavish private banquet hosted by a billionaire. While guests had yet to arrive, activity inside the temporary kitchen complex was already in full swing. Yvette Lee Winthrop was 44 years old and served as the longtime private chef for a billionaire family known for hosting lavish banquets and charitable events. Over the course of her career, she had overseen hundreds of large dinners, celebrations, and private gatherings. She was accustomed to long hours and demanding schedules, especially when preparing meals for clients with exacting expectations. It's the kind of job where everything is expected to be perfect. Even sometimes nobody notices the effort behind it. One of the banquet's main ingredients was king crab, a luxury seafood item that required extensive preparation before it could be served. Rather than arriving ready to use, it needed to be cleaned, processed, and portioned by hand. The work was tedious but familiar, and Yvette had performed similar preparation countless times throughout her career. Throughout the morning, she worked alongside a small kitchen team preparing ingredients for the evening service. As trays moved between workstations and prep tables filled with partially completed dishes, Yvette spent several hours handling the ingredient directly. The preparation process released fine airborne shellfish proteins that gradually accumulated throughout parts of the workspace as the day progressed. I have to admit, this is the kind of kitchen work most guests never think about. By the time food reaches the table, the hardest part is usually long over. Around mid-afternoon, Yvette began experiencing mild irritation in her eyes and throat. At first, she dismissed it as a normal consequence of working long hours in a busy kitchen. Large events often involved heat, fatigue, and little opportunity for rest, so the symptoms didn't seem particularly unusual. As the afternoon continued, however, the irritation became more noticeable. Her eyes watered frequently, and she developed a persistent cough that seemed to worsen whenever she returned to her workstation. Even then, nothing about the symptoms appeared serious enough to interrupt preparations. Over the next several hours, the discomfort continued building. By early evening, Yvette complained of chest tightness and increasing difficulty taking deep breaths. She stepped outside several times, hoping the fresh air would help, and while the symptoms briefly improved, they repeatedly returned once she resumed work. Despite the growing discomfort, she remained focused on keeping the banquet on schedule. As final preparations accelerated ahead of guest arrivals, Yvette's condition worsened significantly. The coughing became more frequent, her breathing increasingly strained, and routine tasks left her visibly exhausted. Shortly before guests were scheduled to arrive, she suddenly became severely distressed while working near one of the preparation stations. She struggled to catch her breath and was forced to stop working entirely. She'd spent hours trying to push through it, but there was only so much she could do. Kitchen staff immediately called for emergency assistance and moved her away from the preparation area. Despite those efforts, her breathing continued deteriorating. Within minutes, she became increasingly unable to communicate and eventually lost consciousness. Emergency responders arrived and transported Yvette for treatment, but her condition remained critical. Despite continued medical intervention, she died later that night before the banquet ever began. The event was canceled, and investigators later focused their attention on the king crab Yvette had spent much of the day preparing. Air samples, preparation records, residue collected from work surfaces, and medical findings were all reviewed as part of the investigation. Their findings revealed that microscopic shellfish proteins released during hours of cleaning, cutting, and processing the crab had accumulated throughout portions of the kitchen. Prolonged exposure triggered a severe respiratory reaction that progressively worsened throughout the day. The final report concluded that Yvette died from complications related to acute respiratory failure caused by occupational exposure to airborne shellfish proteins during food preparation. Investigators determined that the incident was accidental and found no evidence that any prepared dishes had become unsafe for guests. Some food tragedies happen at the table. Others happen long before a meal is ever served. Along the Gulf Coast, a high-stakes food competition funded by a billionaire was about to take a very different turn. It was November 3, 2018, and a luxury resort along the Gulf Coast was hosting a high-profile food competition funded by a billionaire entrepreneur known for sponsoring extravagant culinary events. Contestants from across the country had gathered for the invitation-only event, which challenged participants to identify ingredients, evaluate flavors, and distinguish subtle differences between some of the world's most expensive specialty foods. Giancarlo Marinelli was 37 years old and worked as a restaurant consultant for several luxury hospitality ventures owned by his billionaire father-in-law. Passionate about food and always eager to experience something new, he regularly attended culinary festivals, tasting events, and industry gatherings. The competition offered one of the largest prizes he had ever pursued, and he arrived determined to make the most of the opportunity. For someone like Giancarlo, that sounds like a dream assignment. Unlike traditional cooking contests, contestants spent most of the day tasting and evaluating food rather than preparing it. Throughout multiple rounds, participants sampled small portions of specialty products while judges scored their accuracy and observations. As competitors were gradually eliminated, the remaining finalists were required to participate in increasingly demanding tasting sessions. By mid-afternoon, Giancarlo had advanced into the final group. The last round centered around bitter apricot kernel kernels, a specialty ingredient sometimes used in luxury culinary and confectionery products. Contestants were asked to evaluate the ingredient repeatedly under different preparations and flavor combinations. Individual portions remained small, but the tastings continued for hours as judges narrowed the field. I can see how easy it would be to get caught up in something like that, especially with a prize on the line. As the competition entered its final stages, Giancarlo remained near the top of the standings. Determined to stay competitive, he participated in every tasting session and rarely stepped away from the judging area. Several contestants took extended breaks between rounds, but Giancarlo continued pushing forward. Late in the afternoon, he began experiencing mild abdominal discomfort. After hours of tasting food, a minor stomach ache didn't seem particularly unusual. Giancarlo brushed it aside and continued competing. As the evening progressed, however, the discomfort gradually worsened. He became increasingly nauseated and complained of cramping that seemed to intensify after each additional round. Witnesses later recalled that he appeared noticeably fatigued by the end of the competition, though he remained determined to finish. By the time the final scores were announced, Giancarlo looked visibly unwell. He complained of worsening abdominal pain and nausea, but declined suggestions to seek immediate medical attention. Instead, he returned to his accommodations hoping rest would help. Throughout the night, his condition continued deteriorating. The pain became increasingly severe, and repeated vomiting left him dehydrated and exhausted. Eventually, he contacted emergency services as the symptoms became impossible to manage on his own. Giancarlo was transported for treatment, but despite continued medical intervention, he died the following morning. The sad part is that Giancarlo was doing something he genuinely loved, and he never got the chance to enjoy the prize he was competing for. Attention soon centered on the bitter apricot kernels featured throughout the final round. Ingredient records, serving logs, medical findings, and leftover samples revealed no contamination or preparation errors. Instead, testing confirmed elevated exposure to naturally occurring cyanogenic compounds present in the kernels. While small tastings are generally considered safe, finalists in the competition spent hours repeatedly sampling the ingredient through multiple rounds and evaluation. Competition records showed that Giancarlo participated in nearly every tasting session and accumulated one of the highest levels of exposure among all contestants. Investigators concluded that repeated tastings over several hours resulted in an unusually high intake that would be unlikely under normal dining conditions. The final report concluded that Giancarlo died from complications related to cyanide toxicity caused by excessive consumption of the ingredient. The death was ruled accidental, and a later review of the competition format identified how repeated tastings had allowed exposure to exceed intended limits.